League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan voter education organization encouraging informed, active participation in government. We believe that voting is a fundamental citizen right that must be guaranteed. While the League does not support candidates or parties, we do take positions on issues we have studied. Our programs will not necessarily represent these positions, but provide forums to increase public understanding of policy issues. And we'd like to make an important policy announcement this evening. The League of Women Voters of Washtenaw County reminds you that we and the League of Women Voters of Michigan oppose the Secure MI Vote petition drive. The Secure MI Vote ballot initiative affects everyone's voting rights. Here are only a few of the reasons why. It eliminates the affidavit option if you don't meet ID requirements at the polls. It mandates that people disclose partial Social Security numbers when registering to vote, creating an identity theft risk. It requires driver's license or state ID number or the last 4 digits of a Social Security number on applications, further creating an identity theft risk. If adopted, and this is probably most importantly, if adopted, it will be referendum proof. Michigan voters won't be able to repeal it. If you would like to find out more, you can go to lwvmi.org and click on advocacy, or read the press release about our stand, and we are going to put a link in the chat to that press release. But you can also find it on the lwvmi.org website. Share these links widely, inform your friends and neighbors about Secure MI Vote. And I think I would like to hand it over to Teresa now.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. Yeah, be sure to check the chat for those links because that's an important action. So welcome, I'm Teresa Reid. I'm Vice Chair of the Program Committee for the League of Women Voters of Washtenaw County. Tonight, we're happy to present the second of 3 quarterly programs exploring Washtenaw County's response to the climate crisis. Our Lunch and Learn programs held on the 4th Friday of the month, typically, not this month, but typically, are also dedicated to the environment and climate crisis this quarter. Just 3 months ago, in August of 2021, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, issued its 6th report. For the first time since its founding in 1988, the IPCC speaks with certainty about the total responsibility of human activity for rising temperatures and warns that the planet will warm by 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 2 decades without drastic moves to eliminate greenhouse gas pollution. As we know from painful experience, climate change brings catastrophic heat, cold, floods, drought, storms, and fire worldwide. We can expect more crop failures, species extinction, heat-borne diseases, civil and international conflict over disappearing resources, and overwhelming flows of millions of climate refugees. Even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow, sea level will continue to rise as polar ice melts in a warmer world. It's no wonder that Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, called the IPCC's latest report a code red for humanity. Guterres continued, "This report must sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet." The just ended UN convened global conference on climate change, known as COP26, took few meaningful steps to address this catastrophe. Tonight's program is titled Environmental Justice in Federal Policy with Professor Kyle Whyte. Professor Whyte's an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and is the George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability, focus on environmental justice at University of Michigan School of Environment and Sustainability. We're starting a little late this evening because Professor Whyte is also a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which just finished meeting about 10 minutes ago. So we're super glad to have you here, Professor. Indigenous systems of care for the natural world and all its inhabitants are rooted in a belief in mutual moral responsibilities in the circle of life. Indigenous groups worldwide have cultivated deep knowledge and practices for living sustainably within the natural environment. The Indigenous model is very different from the careless rapacity of the extract, burn, and dump mindset that has created the existential crisis now threatening all living systems on the planet. What can we learn from Indigenous leaders as we try to find morally responsible and effective solutions to this human-made crisis? How do we ensure that proposed solutions do not further hurt the Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities that already suffer from severely unequal distribution of pollution and toxic waste? How do we ensure that Indigenous voices are heard and respected in the search for equitable solutions? Professor Whyte is here to address these and other questions, and we welcome you, Professor Whyte. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, and I appreciate the nice introduction, but I appreciate even more the chance to connect with this community. And I just appreciate hearing from you and Shelley about all the preparation that you do on a number of different issues. I think it makes a huge difference in really mobilizing people's awareness and their education and understanding on issues that not only affect their lives, but on issues that actions we take on those issues can have a significant change on the lives of others, even people we don't know or who are from faraway places in terms of where we live. So I wanted to make some remarks and comments tied to some major policy issues that are occurring right now. And I think it's important to be tracking as issues that will eventually in the long run, really define how the US government is doing business, as well as how particular states like Michigan are doing business. So I wanted to start with a couple of background points about climate change and environmental justice. So first of all, with regard to climate change, and as Teresa was saying, most of my work is on Indigenous people. We now have substantial scientific evidence as well as substantial testimonies from people who experience climate change that the worst aspects of climate change will affect Brown, Black, and Indigenous people harder than many other populations. And certainly people who are affected by low income are also among the people that will face the largest burdens. And for Indigenous people, this is especially troubling because of our history. Remember, the reason why there's a climate change crisis is because certain industries as they related to governments engaged in land use activities that burned fossil fuels, that extracted minerals, that deforested, that created unchecked overdevelopment. All of those are activities that increase concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and produce the warming effect that destabilizes the climate and causes all sorts of the problematic impacts that Teresa described. Now, how did those industries, how did they take root so quickly, right? I mean, most of them started in the 19th century, some a little bit earlier than that. How did those industries take root? Well, in the United States, which was an industrial leader and still is in the world, they were able to take root because they dispossessed Native people of our lands and territories. And then they set up shop, the mining, the chemical and fossil fuel transportation, the other aspects of the industrial networks. They set up shop right next to our lands, and they degraded many Indigenous communities over generations. And so even though Native people were dispossessed onto much smaller areas of land, those smaller areas of land were then threatened by tremendous burdens of pollution. And so we know that this is what happened. This is what happened factually. And we know the complicity of the United States federal government and state governments in this process with private industry. And so Native people first had to deal with the very origins of human-caused or anthropogenic climate change when we were dispossessed of our lands and our lands began to be degraded, which is something that would then continue for many generations. And that's really what environmental justice is. Environmental justice is a situation where a privileged population, a colonial population, a capitalist population, they want things that are on your land. and they'll do whatever they can to get those things. And so an environmental injustice occurs when one society benefits by overburdening another society with extremely harmful environmental stressors and threats and pollutants. And they essentially treat the harmed societies as sacrifice zones, and that the people in those societies that are harmed the most, that their lives don't matter as much. And beyond their lives, their cultures don't matter, their ways of life don't matter, their economic success doesn't matter. And so in the United States, this is a story that is unfolded with respect to Indigenous people. And I focused just now on the experiences of Indigenous people. But I think it's important to note that for many Black and Brown communities, they would have very, very similar stories to share as well. And for a number of different groups, we face different combinations of oppression. All of our communities experience combinations of racial capitalism, ableism, patriarchy, colonialism. And so it's important that we all work together to address the compounded impacts of oppression that have gotten to the point where now we're among the populations who are most threatened by climate change. So I was part of a recent amazing author team, and we just published an article in Science a few weeks ago. And in the article, we demonstrated that the lands that tribal people in the context of the US were removed to are actually lands that are more vulnerable to the most severe climate change impacts, wildfire, drought, others, than the lands that they were on historically. And when I've worked more specifically with different tribes on their climate change issues, the reason why tribes are in areas that are more prone to coastal erosion, are more prone to being affected by extreme precipitation events and flooding and drought and other climate change effects, such as effects on lakes and fisheries, is not because they just live in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's because those tribes were forced into those areas, and because Native people's lands have been reduced in size and our sovereignty has not been fully recognized by the US, we have very few options for being able to adapt. We don't have the entire continent to take into consideration in terms of how we adapt to change. In the paper, we also found evidence that Native people were cut out of the energy sector. There aren't very many tribes that operate energy utilities at the scale that private industry does, that large investor-owned utilities do. And even though Native people are governments, 574 of us are recognized as sovereign in the eyes of the US, our economies are essentially embargoed because we have extreme limits in terms of what types of business opportunities we can pursue. And one example of that is the energy sector. And so many tribes oftentimes depend on getting dirty energy from others. Historical policies, such as the Rural Electrification Act, often the electrification grid did not reach many reservations and tribal communities. And so we're dealing with a situation where generations of infrastructure disinvestment have made it so that we're cut out of the energy industry. And so we're seeking to reestablish leadership in the energy sector with a new vision of what an energy sector should actually be like, that's based on renewable energy and respect for the environment around us. And so in this way, climate injustice regarding Indigenous people, including the tribes in Michigan, involves a number of factors. It involves taking action to address the ways in which our cultures, our way of life, are vulnerable to climate change. The Intertribal Council of Michigan, for example, produced an analysis for tribes on climate change vulnerabilities, talking about which plants and animals were facing the biggest threats, and which particular cultural traditions that may be associated with those plants or animals, or economic traditions such as fishing would be affected as well. But then we're also fighting against the fossil fuel sector, and an organization that I'm a member of that I'd really encourage folks to learn more about is the Anishinaabe Caucus. The Anishinaabe Caucus in the Michigan Dems is a group of Native folks and allies that are taking on issues tied to the fossil fuel sector, one of which is the Enbridge Line 5. And so Enbridge Line 5 is not only a pipeline that threatens the territories of Anishinaabe people, including cultural traditions, areas where our cultures originated, but it's also something that challenges the Anishinaabe vision of what a renewable energy-based economy should be like. And it suggests a a vision of the future where we're dependent on a couple of industries that provide fossil fuel industry or energy, and that again contribute to that high concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are a huge factor in human-caused climate change. And so the Anishinaabe Caucus is working on Line 5. They're working on a number of other environmental issues tied to climate change, such as the conservation of wild rice, but also related issues. For example, murdered and missing Indigenous women. Across the United States, the fossil fuel sector and the man camps that are formed around places where mining and extraction occurs are among the hot spots for the trafficking of Indigenous women and girls and non-binary persons. And so I think it's important to note that for us, something like climate change or climate justice is not only about sort of discrete environmental effects. It's about gendered and sexual violence. It's about the trafficking of human people. And so groups like the Anishinaabe Caucus are really leading with a vision for building power and addressing the issues that matter the most to Indigenous people. And statewide, there are a number of important organizations in Michigan that are doing this work as well, supporting Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Another is the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition that also has a great website with a number of their campaigns and educational materials about some of the biggest climate change and climate justice issues that are affecting people here in the state of Michigan. Now, in terms of some of the current policies, just given the background I described, environmental justice is something that many communities would say that they've faced for generations. But there's also another story about how the United States as a government began more recently to pay attention to environmental justice, and Michigan plays a fairly prominent role in that history. So in the 1960s and 1970s, there were a number of communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, that were bringing light to the fact that they were nearby dirty waste facilities for tribes, that they were facing treaty rights violations. And so numerous communities were uplifting the fact that they were facing disproportionate burdens of environmental stressors. And so in the late 70s and early 80s, more people began to take notice, and there was eventually a study produced called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, which showed that Black communities were more likely to live nearby hazardous waste facilities. And the University of Michigan hired one of its first African-American faculty, Bunyan Bryant, who was hired to teach civic engagement. And Professor Bryant eventually was among the people that caught wind of environmental justice issues and created our environmental justice program at the University of Michigan to teach students how to engage in politics and community organizing and policy change in order to stop environmental injustice. And so in 1990, the University of Michigan hosted a conference on environmental justice. And that conference actually invited people from the Environmental Protection Agency, from EPA. And that led to putting more formally environmental justice on the map. And in 1994, President Clinton issued Executive Order 12898, which was to require federal agencies to consider environmental justice in their permitting and regulatory processes. And if you ask anybody at EPA who was there at the time, they'll say it was that Michigan conference in 1990 that put it on the map for them. Now, in the same year, there was a national convening of diverse people of color on environmental justice. They produced a document called the Principles of Environmental Justice. Those principles are actually appealed to widely by federal agencies, by organizations, by political parties, and others as guiding for how to address environmental concerns that face communities that are already burdened with economic and social issues. So over time, and EPA has taken a lead on this, but other agencies have engaged in the work as well. Different agencies have tried to enforce environmental justice. And so, for example, EPA has a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. But most people, even people working in agencies, would say that by and large, the environmental justice policy in the US has failed. Companies are still providing problematic scientific information on the safety of their proposed businesses. Many companies are not in compliance and are being allowed to pollute essentially with impunity, with no accountability. And obviously, as we all know, certain companies are able to gain influence because of their perceived economic impact in certain areas and because of the various networks and so on that they rely on for building their own power. And so there's a lot of work to be done with respect to environmental justice, and it can be very frustrating actually trying to work with state and federal agencies just to protect people from being poisoned, just to stop people's basic human rights from being violated. And in Michigan, there are numerous environmental issues happening right now. 48217, a Detroit a zip code, is one of the most polluted zip codes in America with, dozens of industrial permits within it. It's a predominantly Black neighborhood. The North Side neighborhood in Kalamazoo is right next to a paper mill, and the predominantly Black neighborhood is facing horrible risks to their health, and a company that's receiving tax breaks and is not compliant with certain regulations. There's massive issues with lead across the state, recently with Benton Harbor. With respect to Flint, in addition to the water crisis, there's a predominantly people of color neighborhood that's facing the risk from an asphalt facility that's being put in. Tribes are facing issues with Line 5, with treaty rights. Many people of color, such as in cities of Detroit, face high energy bills due to the fact that their homes are not high efficiency homes, that they're subject to investor-owned utilities. And I can keep going on. There's a mine, the Back 40 mine, which is on the Michigan side, but affects the origin story lands of the Menominee tribe, which is on the Wisconsin side. And so Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are facing these issues every day. And while we do make progress on making change with respect to some of these issues, the majority either are dealt with too slowly or are ones in which they never get addressed. And I think one of the issues, and this will kind of be my segue into some of the specific policy, is that we've really begun to push back on this idea that what needs to happen is just the basic mitigation or remediation of these health risks, of these point source polluter or from these points of origin for pollution. It's actually about community development. We should be creating healthy communities where we control our own infrastructure, where we make decisions about our energy system, where we're fully invested in the water infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, where we're making decisions, right? We shouldn't be living in communities that are dependent on others and that are overlooked when the United States makes major infrastructure investments. And so environmental justice is most importantly a vision of new communities and a vision of communities being fully uplifted and having full protection and experiencing all of the benefits of a clean, healthy, and safe environment. And the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, was really put in office because Black, Brown, and Indigenous voters showed up. Groups like Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, the Anishinaabe Caucus, they work to turn out many, many voters on environmental justice issues and on issues affecting people of color communities. And this happened all over the United States. People of color were energized and really showed up. And when the Biden-Harris administration was inaugurated, one of the first executive orders that they did was Executive Order 14008 on tackling the climate crisis. That executive order had an emphasis in it on environmental justice, one of the most intensive emphases on environmental justice ever in the US policy history. And part of that emphasis on environmental justice was the creation of some new policies and programs. So the first thing that happened was the creation of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which has 26 members, and all of us who are on that council have decades of combined experience working on environmental justice issues affecting many communities, from Appalachia to rural and urban Black and Brown communities, to Indigenous communities, to Asian American communities, to many, many others. And there was also the creation of a new interagency environmental justice council, which is made up of leaders from all of the agencies. And the difference now is that whereas the previous national presence for environmental justice, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, primarily reported to the EPA administrator, now we have a council that actually reports directly to the White House, so to the Council on Environmental Quality, which is the White House program that oversees the National Environmental Policy Act. And so it's a chance to actually have influence on environmental justice across the whole of government. And that's exactly what the executive order says, that environmental justice needs to affect every agency. The agencies need to be coordinated, and it's called a whole of government approach. Another aspect of that executive order, and something that our council is working on actively, and that right now is a huge aspect of the climate change policy in the United States, is called the Justice 40 Initiative. And the Justice 40 Initiative is one that I really want to convey to you all, because it's one where our responsibilities as voters and citizens in the state of Michigan is really going to be relevant to what happens with the Justice 40 Initiative. So the Justice 40 Initiative says that in all of the major infrastructure investments that are coming, and so these are infrastructure investments in clean transportation, in renewable energy, in clean water, in climate change resilience, in workforce development. So these are all environmental aspects of infrastructure, right? About sustainable infrastructure. So in all these investments, and I know all of you have been following the different bills that are in play, so hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure, 40% of the benefits of those investments, at least 40%, need to flow to disadvantaged communities. So communities that have faced generations of environmental injustice, 40% as a floor, not a ceiling. And our council was tasked with identifying what does benefits mean. And similar to what I was saying earlier, we took the approach of interpreting environmental justice as creating new institutions, creating a new vision of what it means to live in a community, bringing back educational, social, cultural institutions to our communities, building economic control. And so what we said is that Justice 40, the 40% benefit, means that when the money flows to communities for major infrastructure projects, that it's people in our communities that get the contracts. We get the workforce development to train our community members how to succeed and have careers in those industries created from the new investments. We have local financial institutions that will mobilize our own entrepreneurs. We own the infrastructure or have the equivalent of real community investment in that infrastructure. And that infrastructure planning is made in a way that recognizes that we have been through generations of infrastructure disinvestment. So there needs to be coordination in terms of how different infrastructure needs to be put in place to lead to other infrastructure, right? Like to be able to have renewable energy, you have to have adequate broadband and communications infrastructure, adequate transportation infrastructure, water sanitation infrastructure. So it's a whole systematic way of understanding investment. And so the Justice 40 initiative actually holds federal agencies accountable for their financial investments to matter. And federal agencies oftentimes are providing money to states. And what's happened historically in different states is that the federal money, which may have a purpose, say a purpose related to environmental justice, but the states don't really spend the money in that way. And so one of the big issues for us is to make sure that a state like Michigan is held accountable to spending federal funds in ways that are consistent with Justice 40. And this is a very different way for agencies and states to think about the work that they're doing. It's a deeper way, it's a more community-oriented way. And right now, all of the federal agencies are working to figure out how they're going to do this. And people like myself, we're working on different committees, figuring out how to measure the success of federal agencies in Justice 40. We're developing screening tools for identifying which communities merit the special Justice 40 investment criteria. And at this point, we're not sure whether it's going to work because we've got hundreds of billions coming in, but we haven't yet set up the architecture for it. But I think that this is a long-term process, and the ethos of Justice 40 is what we really need to work toward. But I do have some hope that we will be able to get some important successes very shortly. And so the Justice 40 era has already hit the federal government. And even though we haven't fully developed out how it's going to work, all funding since the end of January is actually subject to Justice 40. So you see many federal agencies that are trying to find ways to make their spending more equitable and to achieve real community impacts. And so for a lot of tribes, for example, this is critical. Many tribes have lacking water sanitation infrastructure, lacking broadband infrastructure, lacking telecommunications infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and are dependent on forms of energy like diesel fuel, which is just not sustainable and is extremely problematic. Or there are many tribes that are still dependent on the coal sector. And so what Justice 40 promises is to transform these communities and these tribal nations and to fully update them and to create the conditions for them to lead and for these infrastructure investments to have a hub-like aspect to them where they just energize all aspects of the community. And so we've made recommendations on how Justice 40 is about cultural revitalization, social revitalization, educational revitalization. And it's a powerful vision. And I think that if we can make at least some of it stick, it will demonstrate that this way of thinking is a way that will continue to energize voters, citizens, and others within the United States, because they'll see the value of community-focused, community-targeted investments from the government. But we have a lot of work to do on this. And so I would encourage folks really to take up this issue of looking very closely at the relationship between the state of Michigan and the Justice 40 initiative. My colleague, Justin Schott, and I at the University of Michigan, we recently published an article in The Hill on the Build Back Better bill. And we looked at that bill, and there's about $555 billion for climate change. But Justin really did a great job breaking down some of the specifics of that. And when you look at it very closely, we weren't convinced that it sets things up for Justice 40, because a lot of it was based on clean energy credits, which are basically ways of making it so that the dirty industries, they get to take more time to clean up their act. And remember, a lot of those dirty industries are still doing business on the lands of, or the neighborhoods of, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And so those clean energy credits are not actually ones that have direct benefits to communities. In fact, they're ones that in some ways coddle and apologize for the dirtiest industries. And that was where the majority of the funds were going. And in some of the great areas of spending, such as spending that would support the development of renewable energy in communities, the financial, it was tiny. It was just a fraction. There wasn't that much allocated to tribes. And there are also other problems, right? There's certain ways of engaging in tax breaks that benefit more affluent people, and that less affluent people really aren't able to take advantage of. So I'd encourage folks to look up that article. If I can obviously in the Q&A provide a link to it, because it represents the type of thinking, in my opinion, that we're really going to need to be engaged in. Because if we're going to get out of the climate change situation that we're in, the climate change crisis, we're not going to be able to rely on the same sort of thinking that's defined every other crisis that the US has felt that it's had. And it's important to remember that and thanks for posting that article, Teresa, that's very nice of you. Every time the United States felt it was in a crisis, it justified in the eyes of the dominant population that it was okay to engage in racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination. And if you look at every time in which Native people suffered the most, it was because they were dispossessed of their land, they were assimilated, because the US thought that it was acting to solve some crisis, whether it was a real or a perceived crisis. And will the climate crisis be any different? It's been pretty disturbing to see that there's a lot of people out there that believe that there's a difference between dealing with climate change and dealing with social justice. And they believe that the topics are separated, and they're not actually separated. if we try to lower carbon footprints in ways that are damaging to people of color, then we're going to create a bubble. We're going to create a situation where only some people benefit from the lower carbon footprint world, but other people's lives will be made worse. And in the White House Council, one of the things that we've taken up very adamantly is that many solutions to climate change are actually going to further entrench environmental injustice. To give you some examples, the restoration and expansion of large-scale dams, hydropower, that's a solution to climate change, excuse me, that continues to inundate Native people's lands and other people that live nearby. And some cases of large-scale hydropower, like Site C in Canada, have actually cut local tribal renewable energy projects or First Nations renewable energy projects out of the energy market. Nuclear is being invested in as a solution to climate change, whether through mining or through the supply chains leading to nuclear energy. There's a lot of damages that are done to people of color, as well as the legacy of the nuclear industry in places like the Southwest, and the widely known health impacts it had on Pueblo and Navajo people. Carbon capture and storage is a technology that would sort of make cleaner some of the dirtiest industries like coal, and would transport those dirty emissions to other places, which would require building more pipelines. Carbon capture and storage literally just sustains for a longer period of time industries that need to change more immediately. And because it's going to create a massive pipeline network, whose lands are those pipelines going to traverse? And the technology itself is not even known to truly work. Other issues tied to renewable energy, which again, I'm an advocate for renewable energy, but renewable energy like wind or solar relies on industrial supply chains and involves mining. And so, I could obviously go on and on and on. And in my work, I've documented some of the literature that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. One of the scary things is that so many solutions to climate change involve actions that will, again, take advantage of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, whether in the United States or in the global majority, right, all over the world. And I think we need to really be serious about the fact that when we look closely at these environmental equity issues, we're not actually trying to slow down progress on lowering carbon footprint. We're actually trying to speed it up, because when we think about all the diverse people that are among the most adamant environmentalists, Native people, for example, are among the most energized environmental advocates in the world, and they've been doing environmentalism before there was such a term as environmentalism in the United States in the mid and early 20th century, or even before the conservation movement of the 19th century. Native people were engaged in this advocacy. Now, that's not to say that we know every exact thing about how to be sustainable. It just says that we've known that we need to be aggressive and take action to protect the environment. And so by excluding us and harming us from many of these solutions, that is going to lead to a situation where we're no longer in the position to develop renewable energy, to develop new ways of controlling and owning infrastructure, new economies. And so that, to me, that exclusion of Indigenous people and many other communities does not sound like a fast route to deal with climate change. Moreover, it's important to note that, right, what makes a society resilient? Is it just having all the technologies to lower carbon footprint? Or is it actually building and cultivating relationships among people where we value each other in terms of our consent, our trust, our accountability, our reciprocity? And if you just think about your own lives and the best friends that you have, or some of your best family relationships, those are all relationships characterized by high levels of consent, reciprocity, and trust, and so on. And the more we cultivate those relationships in society, not only do we resist injustice and begin to build equality and equity, but we create a society, whether locally, regionally, or globally, in which we're much more capable of acting together when times get tough. But when times aren't as tough, we're able to support each other and support each other's freedom and support each other's well-being. And so I think it's important to note that we got into the climate crisis, and this is what I mentioned before, because for Indigenous people and many other populations, our consent, our trust, accountability, reciprocity wasn't respected. That's why we were dispossessed of our land. So the root of climate change is not just humans' capacity to make big chemical impacts in the atmosphere. The actual cause of climate change is disrespect and violence toward others. And unfortunately, that disrespect, that violence, that lack of kinship and consent and accountability, that's going to be what will cause the solutions to climate change to also be extremely negative for many communities. And so it doesn't matter how adamant we are about lowering carbon footprint and shifting the directionality of the increasingly warming world. If we are about equity and justice, we're going to do it faster, we're going to do it more sustainably, and we're going to create a world where we can actually all enjoy the cultural and social plurality, where we can really find ways to build our resilience, because there are going to be future crises. This is just one. There's a biodiversity crisis, a food security and food sovereignty crisis, right? There's a crisis of violence against women and non-binary persons. There's multiple crises happening now, and there'll be more in the future. And so the more time we invest in restoring and repairing and establishing anew the relationships that actually matter, the more we're going to be able to address these problems in ways that avoid death and violence, and people having to not be able to fulfill their dreams and their aspirations. So great to have a chance to connect with you all. And I'm happy to talk about all sorts of aspects of what's happening in Biden-Harris administration and other agencies around environmental justice or other historical questions that you might have, and look forward to hearing some of your questions.
Thank you so much. I've been furiously typing notes to keep track of what you're saying. And it's also, no, it's fantastic. Thank you so much. And one of the things that just struck me, because one of the first questions I had was about the failure of COP26. And that's like the very, that's at the global perspective. But you were just ending on talking about the most intimate perspective, relationships among humans and the natural environment. And it's so interesting how the failure of those relationships at the intimate level have resonated, and throughout COP26, I fear. So I kind of want to go the whole span of that consideration, if that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know some of you know a lot, or at least some of the basics of the international system with regard to climate change, but I'll just go over a couple of items. So, currently there's a lot of emphasis placed on the idea that different countries, so the actual nations, that they would actually be able to develop domestic policies that would suppress their carbon footprints. And so according to the Paris Agreement, it's really up to other countries to develop plans and then share those plans with the other countries, and that all the other countries would sort of work together in a transparent way to figure out collectively how they were going to lower carbon footprints. But the problem is that nobody ever agrees to a way to do that that will truly avoid some of the most dangerous climate change impacts. But they also can't agree on how to do it equitably. And so if you look up climate change and environmental justice, the most common topic you'll find is not actually what I've been discussing here. The most common topic you'll find is the difference between countries like the US and Canada, in diverse countries in Africa and Asia who are subject to some of the worst forms of colonialism and are also at risk from some of the most severe dangers from climate change, but are also dealing with the challenge that they're trying to raise the well-being of the lives of their citizens. But the most available strategies for how to do that are to burn fossil fuels. And so countries that are responsible for reaping the benefits of the fossil fuel revolution are not actually providing the support that other countries in the world need to develop their economies in ways that are renewable, rejuvenative, and clean. And many countries like the US and China, they're just unwilling to do what it takes to take leadership in terms of truly investing in the infrastructure and the equity policies that would be needed to get us to the point where we would avoid some of the worst and most dangerous impacts from climate change. And so there's different approaches people are taking about how to interpret the COP26. I certainly think that we should be very critical of it, and we should continue to raise our voices that it's unacceptable. At the same time, this is probably, I think, the first COP where the United States actually had some version of a legit domestic policy in the Build Back Better plan. And that's why I think it's important to understand that if we advocate here for Michigan's following through with the Justice 40 aspects of the major infrastructure investments, that's a serious contribution to the domestic climate change policy in the US. Because if Justice 40 means that a lot of the renewable energy or even clean energy investments are supposed to be spread across diverse communities, then that means that if Justice 40 is implemented, then those projects will happen and we'll get the energy savings, we'll get the lower carbon footprint. So if we push our states to implement Justice 40 in terms of the areas where the federal government has invested money in those states, that's a huge contribution to the US's contribution in terms of its own national approach to climate change. And I think that right now, and this is another international issue, I think many of you have seen that one of the reasons why the US is pushing for infrastructure is because there's a global competition. And China, for example, is engaged in infrastructure investments, not only within its own national borders, but everywhere else in the world, different parts of Asia and Africa. And I think people are beginning to understand that the US is over investment in its military is no longer going to sustain the US's position within the world. And rather, the countries that are taking infrastructure leadership and working with other countries on their infrastructure development are going to be the countries that are going to have the most important roles in the future. And in terms of countries, I'm not an expert on this, but in terms of countries that have dealt with some of the Chinese approaches to infrastructure development, I think there are a lot of concerns with consent, with issues of power and control. And I think it's up to the United States and other countries to develop a mode of infrastructure investment that centers equity and justice. And so I really think that's what the Justice 40 initiative can mean globally. It's a way of demonstrating that a large country like the United States, with its high carbon footprint, can lower its carbon footprint and doing it in a way that does not trade off equity issues and justice issues.
That's really exciting possibility. And I want, what is there like a toolkit for us to use to push our legislators and executive branch? I mean, how do we individually do that?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of resources that I would like to share with you. One, I think I probably need to attach to the Zoom because it's a big report. So let me see if I can access it. It's big, but it's clear. So you might see me kind of looking over while I answer your question more directly. But so there's two places to look. Oh, great. Let me see if it has the link. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of links.
Okay.
And then I'm going to start
in the chat.
At this time of night, I realize I have trouble multitasking. I've been in meetings for since very, very early in the morning. So
Yeah, I hear ya.
I'm still pretty good, but my multitasking has been lost. So anyway, so I put these links in and I'll explain what they are. So the second link is, I think, an important guide for directing the information gathering that you all are going to do. It's the interim guidance on Justice 40 that was issued by the White House over the summer. And the interim guidance defines who a disadvantaged community is, And it also lays out the federal programs that are going to be subject to Justice 40. And I believe also references some places where Justice 40 might be piloted, including, I believe, some Michigan areas like the 48217 zip code.
Uh-huh.
And so I think what we need to do is in our evaluation of politicians and candidates, as well as state level actions by politicians, to actually be looking at where are the connections, which of these programs are ones that manifest in Michigan. And we need to actually be asking candidates about how they're going to advocate for this, and actually holding our state agencies accountable, like the various environmental agencies and the social services agencies. So I think we can use that interim guidance in that way. I think another thing that we can do, and this is the first link that I sent, is it's not just about government, it's also about philanthropy and fundraising, and also about private industry. And I think that we really need to be out there advocating that the charitable funders are also investing in ways that will connect communities to these resources. And so I'd appreciate folks taking a look at both of those documents. And that first link has a lot of good information on how Justice 40 has already operated in other states. And not the formal Justice 40 initiative, but Justice 40 was crafted after a couple of initiatives that operated in states like California.
Uh-huh. Okay, that's fantastic. That's really helpful. And, you know, I noticed in your bio, you're a leader of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, right? Is that another source for guidance on this? And can you tell us more about that coalition?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a coalition of a number of organizations across the state that work for environmental justice in different communities. And we have a full-time staff of about 10 amazing individuals. And actually, we just received an award from Clean Water Action as Advocates of the Year. And so if you go to our website, you can see some more information about our campaigns, as well as some of the documents that we've created on climate change. I don't think that we have that much up right now tied to Justice 40, but you all will be among the first that I send that information to you when it develops. But I definitely look to us as a place for some excellent analysis and educational materials, but definitely check out our website.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So that's exciting. We have significant actions to take, and I love that we work at the local level to have an impact globally. Think globally, act locally. A couple questions. So, and I hope somebody will monitor chat for me and see if anything's coming in. You have written also about the importance of protecting the sovereignty of Indigenous knowledge, of not letting it be co-opted, not letting Indigenous people be treated as objects or pawns yet again. Can you speak more to that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's and I provided in the chat much earlier on a link to the article that I mentioned that we just published. I think that article is instructive for your question. And so I think it's important to note, right, that you know, as Native people, those of us who are members of tribes, you know, we're the original people in this territory, and for generations we cultivated the landscapes. We developed all sorts of provocative ways of thinking about economics and politics and society. You know, so for example, for Anishinaabe people, the original people of Michigan, and Potawatomi, which is my tribe, is Anishinaabe tribe. So we had a way different way of thinking about like political science and economics. So for Anishinaabe people, for example, we actually didn't have historically like one central government. We had multiple governments that operated differently depending on what season you were in. So like, for example, at particular times of year, the main form of government might be like the nuclear family. In other times of year, it might be an extended kinship network. Other times it might be a tribe. Other times it might be something like a nation. It just depended on what you were doing during that season. If you were out in the woods doing sugar bush maple sugar harvesting, it was the smaller family unit. If you were having a large fishing camp, it would be the much larger band unit. If you were doing diplomatic engagement, such as up in the Sault Ste. Marie area, then you are almost like a nation. And Europeans and eventually American settlers couldn't get their head around this because they wanted there to be a centralized nation. But what they didn't understand is that we developed a system where our political science was also environmental science. We were trying to be adaptive to the dynamics of ecosystems. We weren't trying to create a well-ordered society and then deal with the environmental stuff. We were trying to do both at the same time. And so we had a society that knew how to expand and contract. People lived in different places in different parts of the year. And somebody would say that they have a different affiliation or nationality, depending on what time you encountered them during the year. And that's why some of those old maps that Europeans developed of the Great Lakes region would describe people like the Beaver people or the Fire people. And it just didn't even make any sense because they didn't understand that we weren't organized into centralized nations, but had a highly adaptive, flexible form of governance. And so for us, right, this is just an example of the large body of knowledge that we have. A lot of our knowledge has been threatened by colonialism and assimilation, but we have a vision for America that's very different from the visions that are most dominant today. And for us, I think the American dream is much more about creating a society that is equitable, where people are allowed to express themselves, where we care for the environment. And again, it's not to say that we have all the answers. It's not the romantic view, but it's just to say that we're coming from a different place. We didn't create and we don't participate in the dominant settler narrative that is just everywhere in the media, in the buildings, in the infrastructure, in everything, right? The family life. We didn't create that. We didn't design it. And I think right now, it turns out to be that some of the largest problems in the world are ones that could really use some of the thinking that Indigenous people have. But it's also really important to note that we're dealing with a lot of issues internal to our communities. Colonialism and racism is real, and it's occurred across generations. And so for many of us, we work very hard within our own communities. There are many folks that are returning back to their communities, having been displaced due to forced adoption, urbanization, and other historical and social factors. But then we're also taking leadership internationally and nationally. And right now, for example, in the Biden-Harris administration, there's a number of Native people from Michigan, like Brian Newland, for example, who have high up positions in major departments like the Department of Interior. We have tribal chair people like Aaron Payman, who plays a huge role in the National Congress of American Indians. And so we're taking these national leadership roles as well. And we're really demonstrating that our voice and our vision can really lead to a different America. And the more people learn about our history, the more I think it unmoors people from having to accept this sort of narrow, dominant understanding of America that's force-fed to us from a very young age.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you didn't mention Deb Haaland.
Well, I was mentioning Michigan natives in that. So if I was expand to all Native people, right? Not only is there Deb Haaland, but the new National Parks Director is going to be a Native person. And actually, you look across a number of important agency roles that don't get as much media attention. You're seeing a lot of Black, Brown, Indigenous people. You know, for example, in the Department of Energy, my former U of M colleague, hopefully returning, but Tony Reams, who is from Detroit. And Tony has a very prominent position in the Department of Energy. He's working on Justice 40 issues. He's working on numerous energy equity issues that are going to create change for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And so I think that's one of the exciting things about what's happening, and something that will have a lot of long-term implications, is that we just have a lot of amazing people now in different government positions. And so I think that's going to be something for the future.
That's fantastic. When Deb Haaland was appointed appointed Interior Secretary, I wept. I mean, the beauty of that and the meaning of that was so important. Is she able to function? I mean, how's she doing?
Well, we've seen some amazing updates just this week, because this week in Washington, there was a tribal nations summit with the president, with the executive branch. And actually under the Trump administration, that activity had been suspended. It never occurred. And Department of Interior was part of some huge game-changing initiatives. One of them was a renewed commitment by the White House to addressing murdered and missing Indigenous women and human trafficking, and to improving the laws and policies around sexual violence. And well, that's another topic. I'm just going to say something brief about that, is that the issue of the predominance of and the lack of attention of murder and missing Indigenous women and non-binary persons and girls, and violence against all Native people has a lot of different causes, right? I mean, obviously one is the dehumanization of Native people, but there's also a cause tied to some of the legal issues that tribes have faced due to how our governments have been encumbered. And to make a long story short, in the United States, and still to this day, but it has been improved a little bit, there existed a system where a person who is not a member of a tribe could commit a felony, including sexual violence, in a tribal community, and it would be very hard for that person to be arrested and held accountable for it. And so we were dealing with a situation in which not only did you have the actual acts of violence, but an impunity. And there was then evidence that people knew about the fact that they were unlikely to be held accountable, and perhaps they perpetrated even more violence than they would have had there been more of an understanding that they'd be held accountable. And so this is huge, that this is a leading issue right now. But we also saw a number of other key policies. The White House just this week, and again, I attribute a lot of this to Deb Haaland's leadership, issued a statement saying that Indigenous knowledge would be taken much more seriously in federal regulatory processes. And for something like Enbridge Line 5, that means that Anishinaabe people's knowledge of why Line 5 is harmful to their culture, to their origins, to their history, to their economy, has to be elevated more than it is right now. Treaty rights is another one. Remember, Michigan has some major treaty areas. A third of Michigan is under a treaty that 5 tribes participate in, and those tribes have hunting, fishing, gathering, worshiping rights in a huge chunk of the Lower Peninsula and a huge chunk of the Upper Peninsula. And those treaty rights have been interpreted as not just saying that you can, fish if there's fish, but actually that the state of Michigan and the federal government is required to make sure that the habitats for there to be fish are not harmed. And so given climate change is posing a risk through algal blooms and other changes in water temperature, as well as overdevelopment of shorelines and so on, affects the fishery, that it really sends a message that the White House is going to support tribal treaty rights, and tribal treaty rights will make a clean, healthy, and safe environment, not just for tribes, but for everybody. Because again, it's a different vision. It's a way of thinking about rights as rights to be a responsible steward of the land, not rights to just own property and do whatever you want with it. So we're seeing that leadership already, I think, from Deb Haaland. And I think there's many Native people have been fighting for the same issues. And what happens is when you get incredible people like Deb Haaland in these positions of power, they're able to concretize generations of effort and make immediate important impacts.
No, that's very exciting. Elsewhere you've talked about, you've linked patriarchy to the climate crisis as a cause. Can you just, and here we're talking about sexual violence against Native women and non-binary people. Can you talk a little bit, just like draw the connection between patriarchy and the climate crisis?
Sure. And there's a number of different connections and ways to make those connections. So I'll just follow one thread. So
Okay.
if we accept what I'd mentioned a little bit earlier, which is that we wouldn't have a climate crisis if Indigenous people weren't dispossessed of their land. Well, how are Indigenous people dispossessed of their land? What are the details of that story? And the details are things that people aren't taught in school. So for example, just here in Michigan, and some of my own ancestors are part of many of these stories. For Anishinaabe people, there wasn't this assumption that men would be in the most prominent public leadership positions. In fact, for Anishinaabe people, we actually didn't have a tradition that had a strict binary gender system. And people that today would code as women were actually our major diplomats. They were major tradespeople. And a former colleague of mine when I was at Michigan State, Susan Sleeper Smith, has books on the history of Native women in the Great Lakes region and talks about the prominent role women played in mobilizing huge regional networks. And so when the US eventually came to power, one of the first things that the US targeted in order to dispossess us of our lands were women leaders and also non-binary leaders. And they engaged in sexism, they disempowered women, they did things like, refusing to negotiate with women and only with men. And the US kept doing these policies to undermine us. For example, in the 1880s, when the US privatized indigenous lands, so liquidated reservations into private property, the point of that wasn't just to steal the land, it was part of a policy to break up and separate indigenous extended families and force them into nuclear families that were run by male farmers. And it's a very well documented history. This is not in any way an opinion. It's very well documented that groups like the Friends of the Indians in the late 19th century, they actually installed toxic masculinity within our communities to get the land from us. And they created horrific policies. Like, for example, when native lands were liquidated into private property, if you were a native person and had property, if you were declared to be competent, you could be divested of your land. You could sell your land. If you were declared to be incompetent, then you were forced to have your land leased by a white person. So neither option was great. One of the ways you could be declared competent is if you were a woman, if you married a white man. And so in places like Oklahoma, where there was a huge liquidation of tribal lands, there were women that married white men and disappeared. And then the men inherited that property. And so all of this land dispossession that was occurring, whether the land was leased or whether it went into the hands of white people, that was the land that was opened up for the development of commercial and industrial agriculture, for fossil fuel extraction, for mining. And so these are just a few examples. But I think the main point is that if it wasn't for the fact that women and non-binary persons were disempowered, if it wasn't for the fact they experienced violence and were dehumanized, if it wasn't for the breakup of our families, the residential schools, for example, they divested people of their knowledge, but they also forced them to accept very patriarchal understandings of family life. And again, created that toxic masculinity. And the last thing I'll just mention is that if you look in most of the industrial sectors, whether engineering areas or science areas or mining areas, for generations, it's been men that have controlled those industries. Even in academia, right, the fields that are most associated with the fossil fuel intensive industries are still to this day, those departments are mostly men. And in a country like the United States, where whiteness is one of the privileged categories, it's mostly white men. Yeah, and so anyways, there's so much more to say about it, obviously, but these are some of the key threads.
Well, that's so fascinating because it's it just concretizes the statement about patriarchy and the climate crisis. That very specific, historically documented actions to disempower women and non-binary people. I mean, it's the planning that went into it is mind-boggling.
And it's shocking to see. And I can, suggest they might be behind a paywall, but there are definitely some articles that speak to that very clearly and provocatively that I can.
I'd love to see those.
With you all.
That'd be great. While you're looking for that, I'm going to read a question from chat. I would really like to see that. Abby asks, do you have any update on the challenge to ICWA that is going up to the Supreme Court due to claims of reverse discrimination?
As surprising as it sounds, I don't have any updates on Indian Child Welfare Act, though I do have a couple of leads of where you could look. My former colleagues at Michigan State who run the Turtle Talk website, so the Indigenous Law and Policy Center that has great people like Matthew Fletcher and Winona Single and Kate Fort and have many distinguished alumni in that program. If you go to their website, and it's called Turtle Talk, they've done incredible work on Icwa.
Is turtletalk.org?
Let me confirm that.
Okay.
If we Google Turtle Talk Indian Law, it should come up. Yeah, turtletalk.blog.
Oh, .blog. Okay, I got it in chat.
Yeah, somebody mentioned Killers of the Flower Moon, and I think that's a pretty good book. There's also a book by well, there's some Osage scholars like Gene Dennison at the University of Washington, and some other Native scholars like Don Fixico that publish further detailed accounts, and both of Osage issues, but also oil issues facing other tribes. And I think one of the things that's important to note is even back in the early 1900s, tribes were resisting these industries, no different from what we saw at Standing Rock or what the water protectors are doing for Line 3 or Line 5. Tribes were asserting their cultures, their worldviews, their traditions of land stewardship back then to resist these industries.
Another question from Lissa. What state agency will make decisions on the infrastructure money that will come to Michigan? It's a good process question.
Yep. So a big one will be, Department of Environment and Great Lakes, so the Eagle Department, but also the different, the departments that are covering, housing issues, obviously the departments that are dealing with energy. Well, so obviously Eagle is energy, but I mean also, like for example with Line 5, you learn about a number of different state authorities that are responsible for different types of infrastructure. So I would actually say that it's quite a few of the agencies in Michigan that would be dealing with it in some way. And I think a good way to kind of look at that is to go to that interim guidance document that I provided. And if you look up the federal program, you can just through a basic Google search, find out which Michigan departments are implementing that program. And it's usually available on those departments' websites.
And probably the best thing to do at the state level, rather than chase down the departments, is chase down your legislators. And right, and write to the governor and the legislators, and to a certain extent the attorney general, who will have some impact there. But at the state level, the county level, the county commission is also actively working on how to spend what's the word? It's not ACA, it's the initial bolus of funds, and then also the current, the incoming funds. And so if you Google, and if somebody wants to put this in chat, that'd be great, but just Google the Washtenaw County Commission. They're having some open meetings right now to talk about how to commit those funds. And this, you have a voice at the county commission for sure. Absolutely. So yeah, tell the county commissioners that you want to see Justice 40 taken into account in the implementation of all of these funds. Any other questions? I feel so grateful that you're here and feel like I want to let you go.
Well, it's been good to connect with you all and hear the questions. I appreciate the points you just made about the county commission, Teresa. So yeah, I look forward to keeping in touch with you all. I mean, I just work over at a U of M, and my office is right off the diag. So if any of you all are ever taking a stroll on campus, feel free to. Well, unless you're a student or employee at U of M, you can't yet enter my building, but but hopefully when the public health situation gets better, you can pop by and say hello.
Yeah, we can wave or throw pebbles at your window or just meet for
You could
coffee.
definitely do that.
That'd be great. All right, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody else for joining us for Brews and Views tonight. The program committee's focus on the climate emergency continues for the rest of the year, and actually returning to environmental justice. Again, we're staying with environmental justice. So just this coming Friday, for Lunch and Learn, host Shelley Shanfield will talk with Gavin Edwards, who's an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry at EMU, on Detroit's most polluted zip code. So as we've just been talking about tonight. On December 8th, again with Brews and Views, Mike Garfield will join me. He's the executive director of Ann Arbor's Ecology Center and one of the founders of the Association of Mission-Based Recyclers. We'll be talking about all of that in the circular economy. And on December 17th, Lunch and Learn topic is protecting our watershed, keeping our rivers clean and healthy, with leaders of the Huron River Watershed Council. So please join us for all of these. And we want to thank the 3 members of the League's environmental advocacy group, Sandra Serini-Elser, Vicki Paulison, and Kathy Weinman, who've brought terrific expertise and connections to our environmental programming. So thank you very much. Also, thanks to our intrepid tech hosts, Chris Buffington and Allison Ulisny. We hope you'll join us for all of these informative programs. You look for details on email on our website, lwvanarbor.org, which switches to Washtenaw, or the page, facebook.com, LWVAAA. You can register for the events on the website, clicking on the calendar. I want to stress again what Shelley read at the top. The League of Women Voters opposes strongly the Secure MI Vote petition. Do not sign that petition. Go to the link that's in the chat for all the op-ed from the League of Women Voters of Michigan and circulate it and tell your friends, do not sign that petition. Equally important, and another League of Women Voters action item, tell our senators to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It is necessary to save our democracy. A link to more information on that is also in the chat. And that's it for tonight. Professor Whyte, thank you so much. Did he leave? I think he did. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you everybody else. We shall see you soon.